This video has three parts. First, I'll reminisce about how this movie, A Bug's Life, came into my life. Second, I'll compare A Bug's Life to other Pixar films, and I'll compare it to Ants. Yup, we're going to go there. Third, I'll get into some gut-wrenchingly sober analysis of the film. We'll talk about the collectivist irony of A Bug's Life, about gender roles in A Bug's Life, the ladybugs, and the queens in the film. And finally, we'll talk about anthropomorphism, the relationship between humans and ants, the semiotics of insects in the film. Okay, are you ready? Let's roll the title. I was supposed to make a title card for this part. I was going to hold up a piece of paper that said part one, but I forgot to. So just imagine I'd done that. Anyway, in the early 2000s, my parents bought an iMac G3. This is the part where I reminisce. They bought an iMac G3. The G3 was the roundish one with the colorful plastic. This was a few years before the G6 came out. That was the computer that could fly. Anyway, you'll never guess what came included with the computer. Probably you can guess, actually, because it was a DVD of A Bug's Life. Steve Jobs, of course, was deeply involved with Pixar. Those really were the days, you know. Computers, they came with free stuff. A few years later, I think my sister got a laptop that came with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 on it. And the laptop could do a kickflip. She didn't let me play the game at all, but no worries. My mother had a laptop with a game on it called Nanosaur 2. When I was a kid, we never played video games, so I was really bad at them. I looked up Nanosaur 2 earlier today just to reminisce, and I realized, oh, this game has a second level. I didn't even know. I was so bad at video games, it never even occurred to me that there might be a part beyond the flying around in the forest you do at the beginning. Anyway, we also did not watch television in my family, but we did have a television, sort of. It was an old CRT, literally from the 90s. The model, I think it was a potato, is what you'd call it. Nowadays, you can watch A Bug's Life in 4K, and it doesn't really look that great when you do it. Not sure I'd recommend. Back in the day, the movie blew my mind, even though I was watching it on this potato. Really, though, the reason why this movie was such a big part of my childhood was because it was simply the only DVD that we owned. You could watch it again and again and again and again, and you would never have to rewind it, you know? I've probably seen this movie more times than any other, but not for about, 20 years. We watched it so many times, the DVD got all scratched up. We watched it until it wouldn't play anymore. So A Bug's Life has a special place in my heart, but let's face it, this is one of the worst Pixar films out there, at least from the classic era of Pixar. Okay, this is part two. The reminiscing, thank God that's over. Now, let's compare it to the other Pixar stuff. A Bug's Life is supposedly a product of that legendary Pixar lunch where they came up with all their early hits, supposedly. This is the second Pixar film. Toy Story was the first. I've never seen Toy Story. That was before my time. One thing that sets A Bug's Life apart from most other Pixar films is that there are no humans in it. Absolutely no humans. There's a little bit of evidence of humans. There's a scene near this trailer at one point, but you never see any humans. I guess there's no humans in Cars either, which is surely the most ontologically baffling of all the Pixar films. Anyway, there are humans in most of the Pixar films, but they're rarely the focus. Up is an exception, I guess. Ratatouille, sort of. In most Pixar films, the focus is on some kind of subworld, a land of imagination that is kind of defined by playful mimicry. I'll come back to that later. But what I'm trying to say is that in many Pixar movies, the humans aren't the main story, and they're actually sometimes a little bit weird. They are othered in some ways, as if they are the animals, and the animals are the humans. This is kind of it's an interesting operation because, of course, humans tend to speak human languages, and the animals tend not to. But sometimes, in animated films, this is switched. You know, the animals are speaking English, and then you have a scene with a human, and they're like mumbling to each other, or they're saying something like so kind of mundane that it's hardly language, right? If you think about a movie like WALL-E, this is another interesting example because here the humans do speak English and the robots speak robot, but the robots are more expressive and the humans are somewhat dull mumblers, NPCs, right? There's often sort of a dissonance between humans and the subject. That's an interesting hallmark of a lot of animated films and a lot of Pixar movies. A Bug's Life sidesteps this totally by not having any humans in the movie. But what if I told you that there's another character that almost has the same thing going on, and that's the bird. In A Bug's Life, all the bugs speak English to each other, right? Doesn't matter what species you are. If you're a bug, you can speak English. But if you're a bird, forget about it. You are tweeting. I guess they'd call it Xing now. The bird is just an animal. Huh. That's kind of interesting. It's common for kids' movies to have kind of weird dynamics, inconsistencies, and gaps like this. It's no big deal, but I think sometimes it can be sort of telling. So I'll come back to some of the stuff later, but right now we're just supposed to be comparing this movie to other Pixar ones. This film, A Bug's Life, definitely has a sprinkle of the Pixar magic in it. It has the Randy Newman score, which is so nostalgic for me. But there's something more subtle, too. And I'd have to think a lot longer to come up with some real conclusions about, like, what makes a Pixar movie. But one thing that comes to mind a little bit is the attention to scale. Obviously, we've got smaller characters. A lot of these movies have smaller characters, right? Perspective is a big part of the visual logic of the film. I guess when they were trying to make the film, they took a little camera and they put it on Lego wheels and they rolled it through the grass so they could see, what does the world look like from down there? Perspective is a big part of the visual logic. It's also interesting to see how many characters there are. This is another place where scale kind of comes in. A lot of Pixar movies, they have some sense of a greater community, and there's maybe a struggle for the individual to relate to that. Of course, you could describe almost any movie like that, but with A Bug's Life, the greater society of the colony doesn't feel that global, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't feel as big as, real human society, and it's also kind of isolated. So this is another angle on the sort of scale that they have in the movie, where they've got something that's sort of, okay, bigger than a family, but smaller than, like, human society. Again, also, it's sort of almost a rural movie in some ways, because this colony is displaced from everything else, Flick goes to the city at one point. I will be spoiling the movie in this review, by the way. Hopefully you've seen it already, or if not, who cares? You wouldn't be missing too much. Anyway, I'd be curious if you have a thought about what, like, makes a Pixar movie, or if this, how this compares to the other ones. Like I said, the magic is there. I also want to compare A Bug's Life to Ants. Ants was a DreamWorks film that came out at the same time. This was fairly controversial. Steve Jobs and John Lasseter from Pixar and Jeffrey Katzenberg from DreamWorks had a bit of a public argument about, two films coming out at the same time about the same thing. Steve Jobs is usually portrayed as the good guy here. Usually people seem to think that DreamWorks kind of stole the idea. I'm not here to endorse either side, and really, I'm a bit skeptical of the Steve Jobs guy. So honestly, who knows? What happened? But yeah, it is a little bit goofy that A Bug's Life had been in production for many years. A lot of animated films take a long time to make, and this was no exception. You don't have to pay the actors, Well, you don't have to pay them every day they're on the set. Or every day you're filming. You know what I mean? So you can drag on production much longer, no problemo. Anyway, they started making Bug's Life. Oh, look, here's a movie called Ants that's also a movie about ants. I don't know. Growing up, I saw Bug's Life about 100 times, and I saw Ants once, I think. I had a babysitter who really liked it, and she told us, what? You've been watching A Bug's Life? That's crazy. You gotta watch Ants. I think the movie was actually a bit too scary for me when I saw it, though. There's a scene where one of the ants gets his head chopped off, and it was a bit traumatic for me. Watching Ants today, you'll realize that while there's a lot of, like, obvious similarities, everybody talks about how they're so similar, the movies are actually really different. On the surface, I would say that A Bug's Life is better, a bit better. It looks better, but Ants really has some things going for it. Ants is more rewarding for adults, for one thing. It stars Woody Allen as Z, the main ant, and he's really good. He kind of carries the whole movie. I like it. It opens up with this ant he voices with Z, visiting a therapist and talking about, oh, it's tough to be the middle child in a colony of 5 billion or whatever. It's good stuff, honestly. Actually, before that happens, Ants has a credit sequence where the voice actors' names are revealed by a magnifying glass. This magnifying glass kind of frames the movie as coming from a human perspective, right? Presumably, the magnifying glass is being held by a human, right? We interact with humans a number of times in Ants. Ants has a far more famous cast of voice actors. Woody Allen, Sharon Stone, Anne Bancroft, Sylvester Stallone, Christopher Walken. That's just a few of the people in it. A Bug's Life has Kevin Spacey and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. David Hyde Pierce is also in it. He's Niles from Frasier, and he does a really good job as the stick bug. Kind of more television actors, though. Ants certainly has the prestige in the cast, and A Bug's Life doesn't even show any of the actors' names in the beginning. It shows them in the credits at the end, which I will talk about, by the way. But in Ants, it kicks off with, for one thing, a city skyline. Turns out to be grass, but it looks an awful lot like New York. And then these names, all these humans, being revealed by a magnifying glass. So, like I said, being framed much more from a human perspective in some ways. That's a big contrast between the two movies. Ants is much more connected to humans and to 1998. Rather than having the Randy Newman sort of score, some of the music in Ants seems like it could be at home in the movie Office Space. It seems like it could be at home in American Beauty, almost. The film's themes seem to be tied a little bit to like the Gulf Wars. Actually, really, Ants seems like it has something to say about the Iraq War, but it hadn't happened yet. I like some of the darker satirical tones in Ants, but I think also what I've just highlighted maybe underscores what makes A Bug's Life kind of special. A Bug's Life is a movie that doesn't feel connected to 1998 at all. It doesn't feel connected to humans. I mentioned already that the anthill is kind of secluded and cut off, right? There's no humans. There's a lot of other things that Ants does to sort of tie into current political sort of undertones and to tie into just the human world that A Bug's Life completely eschews. And that may be one of the reasons why it could feel a little bit more timeless. It could feel a little bit more magical. Who knows? Ants is much darker. Literally, the style, like the ants are darker colors. There's less light. It's darker thematically, too. It talks a lot about army ants in Ants. There's no army ants in A Bug's Life. So, quite different movies. Talking about the movie Ants actually leads us nicely into one of the biggest themes of A Bug's Life, which is collectivism. So this is part 3 now. All that stuff before, I don't know what we're doing there. But now we're at the gut-wrenchingly sober analysis, okay? Collective irony. Both of these movies have a lot to say about the individual and the collective, the individual and the colony. Let's start with A Bug's Life. The beginning of this movie is really defined by Flick's struggle for individuality. We are introduced to the colony as a place that is deeply beholden to tradition, sort of stuck in the past. Not exactly in a sinister way, but, this is what they know. They all follow the same line to harvest the food. In the beginning of the film, we see all the ants following each other, carrying, like, little pieces of grass or something, and then the leaf falls across the path they're following, and they panic. They don't know how to go around the leaf. They're so stuck in their ways. Interestingly, there aren't really even that many individual ants in A Bug's Life. There are a handful of distinct characters, and then there is the colony, which is sort of one indistinguishable mass. Much easier to animate it this way, and probably one of the reasons why this is like that is because the technology for generating a lot of different ants was still emerging. We meet Flick, right? And he's built this automatic grain harvesting thing. It's interesting, by the way, what agrarianism looks like in this movie. The bugs apparently eat some sort of like grain, which really alludes to human farming tradition. Kind of incoherent. Anyway, Flick is not following the tradition, and he's scorned for this. Eventually, he's kicked out for this because he won't be a team player, because he's too selfish, right? In some ways, these are valid criticisms, but on the other hand, he's just trying to invent this cool thing, right? He's got this grain harvesting machine. In the first parts of the movie, the idea seems to be that ant society does not allow for individuality. And that's kind of a bad thing, right? That's sort of the dramatic fuel of this movie is Flick is not permitted to be himself. When we get to the end of the film, however, we see the ants overcome the grasshoppers simply by banding together, by forming a whole. Quick sidebar to critique a few things about the plot, which I think is one of the weaker points of A Bug's Life. There's a few things that are just a bit half-baked. The plot is circuitous. For instance, the ants build this bird to scare off the grasshoppers, but it doesn't work, and they just end up outnumbering the grasshoppers. Well, why didn't they just do that in the first place? Why couldn't somebody have just pointed out, hey, if you just band together, you can hold your own? That's interesting. The movie also, I think, goes way too far with this semi-comedic misunderstanding about the circus bugs. The flick thinking, oh, they're fighters, them coming to the colony. Nobody really realizing this is kind of a screwball element that really only works if we assume almost a complete inability to communicate. And I don't know, it doesn't quite do it for me. But anyway, back to collectivism. This movie is kind of going two ways. It's endorsing individualism. It's showing how individualism can be snuffed out by a rigid communal life, but it also shows how a strong collective can overcome huge obstacles, right? Slightly mixed message, maybe. What's even more interesting is that Ants does exactly the same thing. Like, exactly the same thing. We see Z worn down by meaningless labor. He's a builder, right? They have a funny scene of baby ants, I don't know the correct term for that, being given like a pick at birth, and oh, that's going to be a builder. Well, he grows up and he becomes a builder. He's down in the mines, but of course, Woody Allen isn't really cut out for mining, I guess. And, he doesn't enjoy this. There's a great scene in the movie where the ants are in a bar after work, and there's an announcement that it's time to dance. 6:15, time to dance. I forget what time it is exactly, but it's like, we've hit the dancing time on the schedule. Okay. All the ants then line up on the dance floor in a row as if they were soldiers, and they dance in sync. They're all doing the same moves. Again, much easier to animate. Z is the only person doing his own thing out there, right? He's dancing his own dance. They have a great version of Guantanamera that's in the score for this scene. Kind of a funny scene, although also slightly cringeworthy in some of the romantic stuff here, but kind of funny. Again, individuality is not on the menu, right? And this is a bad thing. Z is going to strike out for himself, and he's going to discover himself, right? That said, when he returns, it is again a collective action of workers that wins the day. The climax of Ants is also about the colony coming together, right? Very interesting. To take things a step farther, Ants opens up with some seemingly Stalinist iconography. There are big statues in the anthill, statues of ants lifting heavy boulders. Ants, the movie, really latches onto this idea of an ant lifting a large multiple of its weight. They have a bunch of jokes about that. They've got statues about that. They really like this like detail of ants. Well, in A Bug's Life, that's not the case at all. The ants are kind of small and meek. They can carry a little bit. They can't fight. Interesting little comparison. Anyway, in Ants, there are these statues and there are signs with all kinds of proud, almost like nationalistic slogans, right? So in the beginning, like I said, almost this sort of Stalinist feel to the colony. That said, when Z, I won't go into the whole plot here, but when the news spreads of Z's heroics after he leaves the colony, the word on the street is that he's going to start a revolution. And the workers talk about seizing the means of production. They bring in, explicitly Marxist rhetoric to describe the uprising of labor that's going to happen. So we've kind of got communist rhetoric on both sides here, a Stalinist state, but also a communist revolution. Interesting. Now, I'm portraying this a little bit as a contradiction, like the movie is endorsing individualism and collectivism both, right? Oh, how could this be? How could it both be about the individual and about the collective? But in fact, those things aren't really in opposition. A lot of Marxist thinking goes towards the question of how the individual can gracefully coexist with a collective, with a bigger society. That's kind of the whole point, right? On the other hand, there is obviously room within capitalism for various kinds of collective action, for certain types of communities that are maybe non-market even to arise. So I'm not saying that the movies are broken, right? I'm not saying that this is like some impossible contradiction that doesn't make any sense, right? On some level, I think it actually makes perfect sense that people should want both of these things, a healthy sense of individualism and a strong sense of community. That said, both movies do seem maybe a little bit confused in this regard, and that's pretty interesting. In American society today, there are conflicting intuitions about individualism and the community. Like I said, people sort of want both of those things, but I don't know, conflicting intuition. Sometimes maybe people feel like they want to be famous, they want to make a lot of money. Sometimes maybe they really like being a part of community, like the idea of starting a family. Again, they don't exactly contradict, but often people may find themselves juggling these ideas. Maybe this sort of tension is what's coming to the surface. Oh, man. Anyway, two interesting things I wanted to mention. First of all, it's interesting that in the end of Ants, So again, I don't want to run through the whole plot, but part of the idea in Ants is that there's sort of a military coup that is going to happen, and at the end of the day, the coup is sort of put down, but there's been a division between the laborers, like the worker ants, and the soldier ants, the army ants, right? At the end of the day, they actually come back together, which is interesting. And so we sort of reestablish, oh, actually, it's not like a profoundly pacifist film at the end of the day. In fact, it's not a pacifist film at all, really. We conclude with the army actually harmoniously coexisting with the workers. Okay, wanted to mention that. I think something that's maybe even more telling, this is back to A Bug's Life, is that Flick is an inventor of sorts. Inventor, this is a capitalist archetype. I mentioned in my video about the Pinchcliffe Grand Prix that I think invention is a bit of a myth. I won't go through all of that again here. Watch the video if you're curious. But again, we're kind of telling our kids about inventors for one reason or another. We're making movies about inventors when that kind of thing definitely doesn't exist today and probably never really existed, in my opinion. That's kind of interesting. I think that's gives a more vivid angle on why Flick's individuality is so sort of poignant in a capitalist world, right? The idea that he is sort of being held down. Both of these movies try to explain away the tension a little bit, this tension between collectivism and individualism. In A Bug's Life, we have a scene at the end where all the ants are using Flick's harvesting machine. This is maybe implying that there wasn't actually any profound shift to the structure of their society. Instead, the enemy was simply conservatism, fear of change, lack of dynamics. The real problem was that people weren't open to technology, right? And now, hey, the structure of our society hasn't changed, but we're all using the latest gadgets, right? So this is why we're happy. This is why we succeed. This is an interesting idea for a movie in Steve Jobs' orbit to feature. I don't think there's any great conspiracy here, but some of these scenes where the colony is afraid of change, some of these scenes in the beginning, some of these ideas about Flick being cast out because he's not, because he wants to try something new, they might remind you a little bit of Apple marketing. Of course, today, most people have an iPhone, and the idea that a nicely designed phone can bring you individuality has maybe lost a little bit of its luster. When I was a kid, I was proud that I was in a family that had Mac computers. I hate to admit that. These days I use Linux, which is why sometimes the videos are late or there's like weird stuttering or something. Breaks a lot. But yeah, I'm a big skeptic about the sort of Apple brand. And in general, this technology angle in the movie is actually, it's a little unseemly, isn't it? Like this idea that, all he wanted to do was bring new technology into the world and he's being cast out from society for being too individualistic, right? I don't know about that. These days, it seems like, I don't know. We could hit a pause on the new stuff for a while. And the disruption, I'm not sure is exactly a virtue. But in this film, it is sort of praised, and it's under the surface. I really didn't pick up on this until I was really thinking about the movie. It's kind of under the surface a little bit, but again, it's interesting that Steve Jobs was involved with this. Anyway, I was talking about how the movie sort of explain away a little bit this tension. Ants has an interesting monologue at the end where Z says that after all the social upheaval, he actually went back to doing mostly the same things that he was doing before, but that it was different now because it was his choice. I guess this sort of ties a bow on things. He was doing coerced labor before, basically, and apparently he starts to enjoy digging once he's married to a princess. I'm skeptical of this, right? Woody Allen really didn't seem to like swinging the pick very much at all. It seems a little bit weird that he would want to do that later. In general, this idea of like, well, it's choice that matters, that's pseudo-philosophical, right? It doesn't really engage with any of the questions we're talking about here. Is choice really the thing that matters in society and life? Is choice missing from communism? Is it present in capitalism? I mean, like I said, this is pseudo-philosophy, so who really knows? I'm not looking for some brilliant philosophical thesis embedded in a kid's movie, right? There isn't one in either of these films. But the reason I bring all this up is because these movies are very often vessels for gaps and uncertainties in society, and this is no different. I think it's kind of cool that these two movies about ants, two movies about ants, right, both stumble directly into questions of collectivism, right? Which is collectivism is a thorny thing to think about in American culture. Oh, look, these two Hollywood movies are going to both be about ants, and they both run into the same sort of tensions. That's kind of cool. In real life, by the way, I think ants have got to be the ultimate communists, right? I mentioned in my video about Madagascar, Madagascar 2, I guess, that film celebrates behavior which goes against nature, right? The film sort of praises the animals from breaking away from their, like, animalistic ways, but it also simultaneously is, like, in awe of nature. It's praising nature, and it's all about return to the homeland, right? So that's a confused movie, Madagascar 2 especially, or Madagascar Escape to Africa, I think it's called. But it's actually a common issue in anthropomorphic films, this tension between, hey, the virtuous behavior in the film is actually not what these animals would be doing in real life, and that is also the case here a little bit. Ants are well, I don't know. I don't speak Antish. It's a little bit hard to know, but I have a feeling that individuality is really not a big part of ant society in real life, so it's interesting that it should come to the forefront here. This feels a little bit like less conspicuous here than it does in a movie like Madagascar Escape to Africa, maybe just because there isn't sort of a glamour of the ants in the first place. They're bugs, right? So maybe people aren't attached to, like, some sort of reality principle of what an ant might actually do, but it is worth noting that, yeah, surely in real life, ants are communists. Anyway, I mentioned Z marrying the queen. This is a good place to jump to the next topic, which is gender. It's implied that he has a monogamous relationship with Princess Bala in Ants. Now, I'm no entomologist, but this doesn't seem, this seems a bit fishy. At one point, Bala does mention that she is expected to give birth to thousands of ants when she's a bit older. When she takes over her role as the queen, she's going to give birth to thousands, right? This is kind of swept under the rug when the happy ending rolls around and we see Bala and Z, again, sort of in a monogamous relationship. We see her mother, the queen, handling lots of baby ants. Again, probably not the right term, but this is a goofy scene, actually. It's unclear what she's doing. It's like they hand her one of these, like, little ants, and then she's like, okay, and then she gives it to the next person. I almost wonder if they wanted to put a scene of her, like, pumping out the offspring in the movie, but they were worried they'd lose the rating, and so they just substitute this weird scene where she just holds them up. Anyway, there are some inconsistencies, and again, it's kind of a case of trying to shove Hollywood into nature. In Hollywood, you need to praise individualism, and you need to have a romantic relationship. Both of those things are kind of at odds with ants, right? Interesting. One thing that A Bug's Life does give us, though, is a matriarchal society. Flick is the hero who saves the day, so I don't know. You could debate how pure of a vision it really is, but it is interesting to see a queen in charge. And I think the princess in A Bug's Life, whatever her name is a relatively strong character, actually. We see her uncertainties and her insecurities about taking over from her mother, and there's some vaguely humanist moments here. One of the triumphs at the end of the movie is her becoming the queen. That's kind of cool, right? Ants is a little bit different. There is still a queen, yes, but she is a bit feeble, and the real power seems to live with this male general, right? This echoes a lot of films with a ceremonial head of state who is powerless against a coup attempt, right? There's a lot of movies like this where it's a secret agent film, and there's some men duking it out to save the hapless queen from being duped, right? That's kind of the way that ants work, and I wouldn't call this a view of a matriarchal society, right? Another interesting detail is that in A Bug's Life, the only ants that can fly are the queen's daughters. I really like how they use flying in the movie. I think it's a really cool mechanic. In Ants, I think Christopher Walken can fly. Christopher Flyan. Both of these are biologically accurate, I think. I think it depends on the species and a bunch of different stuff about whether or not male or female ants can fly. But like I said, A Bug's Life, much more of a view of a matriarchal society, which is kind of cool. In A Bug's Life, there is also an interesting ladybug character. It turns out that the ladybug is a man. I don't think this ends up being too controversial, but I'm not sure they'd do the same thing today. The circus animals showcase a bunch of interspecies relationships, another hallmark of anthropomorphic films. It's telling that the Hollywood instinct for couple building is so strong that it will hop right across species boundaries. I don't think most viewers would even, I don't think they'd think twice at this. I don't think they'd blink. The coupling, it kind of seems right. They have this mantis magician, for instance, and a pretty moth named Gypsy, probably wouldn't be called that today, and you think, aw, what a lovely couple, right? But of course, this is total nonsense in the real world. Interspecies relationships, not really a thing. The logic of coupling is potent, though. And this leads us to the last topics, which is about the semiotics of ants. The basic idea here is that the ants in both of these movies are not exactly photorealistic. They kind of don't look anything like ants, in fact. Sure, some of this might be limitations of the animation at the time, but there's also a lot of deliberate choice, mainly with the goal of taking human logic, human ideas, human connotations, human structures, a whole bunch of human meaning, and transposing it onto ants, imprinting it onto this non-human subject. That's still kind of vague, but the most obvious thing is just humanization, right? The ants look like people. In A Bug's Life, the ants walk on 2 legs, and they have 2 arms. In ants, they walk on 4 legs and have 2 arms. The grasshoppers have 2 legs and 4 arms. So, no mystery that in A Bug's Life, they're humanizing the ants, but they give the grasshoppers, more limbs, because they're the bad guys. It's a bit more sinister, they're a bit less human. This is basic stuff, but remember that none of this happens on its own. I think these days people take for granted that animators know how to make cute characters. Really, relatable human characters. And any big animated film that comes out today is going to have, the cute character, right? All the various characters might look a little bit like the actors that voice them in some way, right? Ants, in particular, is a good reminder that it was not always the case that people knew how to make, endearing and, cute characters or whatever, right? As much as the technology of animation had to evolve, so did the ways that animators conceptualized non-human characters. That had to evolve. It took time to learn. And like I said, ants is a pretty good reminder that we didn't always know how to do that, because some of the ants are a little bit weird looking. For a lot of these movies, mimicry is really, really important. I talk about this a lot in my video on robots. I don't usually make videos about kids' movies, but I have done a few. Anyway, a lot of the ingenuity and humor of some of these movies comes from recreating, in an unexpected way, the things of the adult world. There are tons of examples here, like when Flick makes a telescope out of a leaf and a drop of water, right? Like the trailer that the circus rides around in, which seems to be a discarded cookie box or something like that. The grasshoppers are likened to a motorcycle gang. Their wings sound like choppers, motorcycles, when they take off. The dung beetle, on the other hand, sounds more like a helicopter. It's easy to take all this stuff for granted, but it's worth thinking about how these little choices tie the movie into a bunch of existing dramatic logic. The coupling is maybe the ultimate example of this. Even though it's 2 different bugs of 2 different species, the movie can quite legibly show that they're in love, right? It can imprint a human concept with all of its connotations onto another species. I guess some people might say that there is love in the animal kingdom, and who knows? It doesn't seem like ants are very romantic. Perhaps the apex of this is that both of these movies feature some hot bugs. Now, to be clear, I'm not personally attracted to any of the bugs in either film. I don't think anybody is. But just about anyone can see, oh, that's supposed to be the hot bug, right? That's pretty interesting. You might think that attractiveness is this intangible and deeply human thing, but apparently its symbols, its hallmarks can be abstracted and transposed onto an ant. If I were really getting into this, if I really had more time, I think it'd be interesting to do an in-depth study of exactly all the different features they do, exactly all the things, exactly all the signs they use to convey this meaning. But hey, man, I do weekly videos, so you're on your own. I will say, though, that Lola from Shark Tale, I think, has got to be one of the most egregious examples of the hot bug. That movie is a mess. But this thing we've been talking about, the relationship between humans and the animated subject, that's the vocabulary to think about that movie, I think. I haven't seen it in 20 years, but or I don't know when it came out. I don't know. I haven't seen it in a long time, but just a much more extreme example of some of these tensions. Anyway, sometimes the idea with this, mimicry or whatever you want to call it, is to graft human narrative logic onto something non-human, and to do it really seamlessly, right? So you're just telling a human story, but you sort of substituted other things for the humans. But the movie also has moments where it plays off these ideas much more conspicuously, right? Where it actually tries to like bring these things to the forefront. For instance, one of the ants in A Bug's Life has a very particular accent. I would say it's a Minnesotan accent, maybe Canadian. This might be a reference to some particular person or some particular actor. I don't really know. Either way, I think it's pretty funny that in this isolated ant colony, out on this island in the middle of nowhere, there would be one ant from Minnesota, right? Here, the movie is using these codes of the real world, but in ways that are deliberately ridiculous. The best example of this is at the end of the movie, actually a little bit after the end of the movie, when we see some bloopers during the credits sequence. Here, we see the bugs messing up their lines. We see the bugs bumping into things. At one point, Flick says, "To infinity and beyond." Molt knocks over the camera, and we see some of the crew bugs like in the background. The Minnesotan ant starts talking to another ant, but it turns out to be a cardboard cutout. These moments are positing a totally ridiculous sort of alternate history of the film's production. It's fun stuff, right? Turns out the movie was actually made by a bunch of little bugs with cameras. As a child, I found this very confusing, bamboozling, bewildering, but now it's one of my favorite parts of the movie. I want to close with a mention of all the work that went into this film. When the ant knocks over this cardboard extra, I think it's actually a bit of a wink to some of the challenges of making this film, namely having to animate so many different ants. These days, I think we maybe take it for granted that the technology for making animated films exists. Of course, cinema and technology have always and probably will always be closely linked, and there are still movies that are pushing the boundaries, but there also are a lot of movies that don't push the boundaries. Now, we can make an animated movie, you know what I mean, without having to invent a whole bunch of stuff, right? In 1998, not so much, and Pixar were really pushing the boundaries here. Even though this movie really doesn't look that great now, I think you can still tell that they were doing something pretty cool, and you get a glimmer of the absolutely incredible era of Pixar films that was to come. Or possibly this is my youth, my nostalgia talking. So anyway, there's some thoughts about A Bug's Life. Decent movie. I do think that like many kids' movies, it has a lot of conspicuous like inconsistencies and gaps that can be pretty telling. Ants also, like I said, I only saw Ants once, so watching it again was interesting. And Ants is much more of an adult movie, so I had a totally different view of that now. I like the movie. Not great, but that's another movie that has maybe even more interesting stuff going on. Again, it's so interesting that some of those films end up with the same themes and the same ideas. Some of them are pretty broad things that happen in a lot of kids' movies or a lot of animated movies. Other ones are maybe a little bit more specific to when you set out to make a movie about ants. What is this? A movie for ants? Anyway, that's A Bug's Life. I'll see you guys next week.